No, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes, good. Well, I'd like to add just to the fact that Stephen has issued and commend PRONI for this opportunity to host this event here. It's testimony to the level of interest that there is in plantation studies, that we have the room virtually full, nearly every single chair taken. So thank you all very much for coming along today. Now, what I'm going to do for the next half hour is to provide, you might say, a framework for looking at the plantation or settlement in Antrim and Down. And of course, you can see where I've put plantation in quotation marks, because of course Bob himself is very much at pains to point out, Bob Hunter that is, that the plantation proper, the official plantation, affected 6 of Ulster's 9 counties. In Antrim and Down we do see settlements in the 17th century, but they can't be considered part of an official plantation. So plantation in quotation marks, as in it's a different sort of plantation. You can see very clearly, I'm not going to this in any detail now, but you can see, for example, the 6 officially planted counties out in the west: Donegal, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Cavan, Armagh, what became in 1613 Londonderry, having previously been County Coleraine. Antrim and Down and Monaghan, not part of an official plantation scheme. So I'm going to be focusing in particular on the 2 eastern counties of Antrim and Down. Now, Bob himself, you can see where he says Antrim and Down ended up a curious melange, very different from the 6 escheated counties where a plantation had been imposed. Escheated being another term for the officially planted counties. And that's Bob himself very rarely actually strayed into Antrim and Down, focused very much more on the official plantation. But in this recently published collection of essays, we have included a previously unpublished study by him on Antrim and Down. So how did that happen? How did Antrim and Down end up this curious melange, as Bob described it? Okay, well, Antrim and Down, like the rest of Ulster, was in the late 16th century made up of a series of different lordships. The most dominant one being those of Clandeboy, North Clandeboy and Antrim, South Clandeboy, mainly in North East Down and the Ards, North Down. Other lordships, such as those belong to, they say, the McGuinnesses or the McCartans. To a large extent, in the early 17th century, much of Antrim and Down did not transfer immediately over into new ownership in the way that we see happening west of the province. Much of South and East County Down, for example, remains in Irish ownership in the first half of the 17th century, still owned by the McGuinnesses and the McCartans. Certainly we see settlements in other parts, and I'll talk about those in a moment, but we don't see the massive transfer of land across Antrim and Down that we do see in the west of the province. We don't see a carefully devised government scheme of plantation, and that's to make those counties different. Now, of course, there had been various attempts to colonise Antrim and Down in the 16th century, none of which had been especially successful. The settlement scheme, for example, of Sir Thomas Smith in the Ards in the 1570s ended up a dismal failure. There was a grand scheme to plant these areas, bring over English settlers, build a great town called Elizabetha in honour of the Queen, but really it all failed. It faltered very quickly and can only be regarded as a complete and utter failure. And as I've mentioned, some of the Irish families continued in ownership after 1600. Some of them were more successful than others. At Shane's Castle, we have a branch of the O'Neills. And although North Clandeboy had been, in terms of their ownership, their ownership of North Clandeboy had been vastly reduced in scale, they still held on to a substantial block of land along the northern shore of Lough Neagh and some other parts of County Antrim. Now, it was vastly reduced from what it had been prior to the 17th century. But still, the O'Neills here continued to exercise some influence and have some sway. In fact, Sir Henry O'Neill, who's here in the 1620s and 30s, really is a remarkable character. He's someone who is praised in Irish poetry of the time, Gaelic poetry of the time, as a man who had successfully adapted the new dispensation. A man who no longer needed to display his prowess on the field of battle, but now he was able to show his tact and grasp of reality through his understanding of the law, and how he was able to pursue his objectives through that means. So it's a very interesting change. The O'Neills here are really a fascinating family, actually, in terms of their adaptation to change. You see the continuity from the earlier period, but the change in the early 17th century. Now, there had been some other settlements in Antrim and Down as well. One of the more successful had been the Bagnall settlement at Newry from the middle of the 16th century. This is a map. It's an extract from a map of Carlingford Loch of 1624, and you can see the new town laid out by the Bagnalls. Building on an earlier site, Newry had been important in ecclesiastical terms, being the site of a Cistercian monastery, for instance. But we see Bagnall developing the town, bringing in English and Welsh settlers, and we see a mix in Newry of Irish and British settlement. And Newry, certainly, and the Bagnall settlement, is one of the more successful of those earlier plantations, or plantations again in inverted commas. Of course, we think primarily of the settlements by Hamilton and Montgomery in northeast County Down, and we would think of migrations of settlers in the 17th century into County Down. Hamilton on the left, Sir James Hamilton, son of the Vicar of Dunlop in Ayrshire, an academic. On the other side, Sir Hugh Montgomery, Laird of Braidstone, also in Ayrshire. Through various strategies, they acquire a vast estate in northeast County Down. There's a tripartite agreement between themselves and Con O'Neill, one of the pre-existing Gaelic landowner in the area. And the result of this agreement, northeast County Down is split between the three of them. So you can see in this map, those lands belong to Hamilton, which mainly take in, for example, North Down, Bangor, Hollywood. Coming down the Ards Peninsula, he has Ballywalter, Kirkcommon, and over on the other side, Killinchy, Ballygown. He then purchases the barony of Dufferin from the Whites and establishes a base at Killylay. Montgomery's lands really taking in Donaghadee, Newton Ards, coming down as far as Cumber. And then this area over here, we have lands that still have remained in Con O'Neill's possession, although soon they were to be dispersed among various settlers. Here we can see Newton Ards prior, and again we can see something of the continuity with the past. Because whenever they were coming in, settlers like Montgomery, for instance, he comes to Newton Ards, establishes his base here, and what he does is he converts the old priory building to his own private residence. He converts the claustral buildings for domestic purposes. He retains the church as a new Protestant church. So making use of the pre-existing buildings. So though this was originally founded as a Dominican priory in the mid-13th century, it still has a continued purpose after the settlements of the 17th century. So again, we see a link, continuity with the past. Now, in North Antrim, we have a different situation altogether. Ian Montgomery will be speaking in due course on the Antrim estate papers in the 17th century. But what happens here is that we see a huge land grant made in 1603-1604 to Randall MacDonald, an estate of over 300,000 acres, over 500 square miles, and absolutely enormous. The largest single land grant made in Ulster in the early 17th century. And yet MacDonald, of course, is from a very different background to Hamilton and Montgomery. MacDonald is, after all, Highlands and Islands Scot. His patrimonial lands were in Islay, off the west coast of Scotland. And yet he manages to adapt to change extremely well. He's in the right place at the right time. In many ways, the grant from King James to him was a recognition of the sway he already had over North Antrim. And it's interesting that in his grant of July 1604, you can see where he was given power to divide his territories into precincts, each to contain 2,000 acres at least, to give these different names, and that they may become manors, and to build a castle or mansion house upon each within 7 years. And Percival Maxwell, in a study of Scottish migration to Ulster in the 17th century, has noted that this almost provides a framework for the official plantation scheme that was rolled out from 1610 onwards. The official plantation having very carefully defined sizes of land grants. Well, here we can see something of the thinking in terms of the desire to create MacDonald's lands into manors of a certain size and to build a castle in each. So this is very much a forerunner of what is happening, what then happens in the west of the province from 1610 onwards. Now in South Antrim, I've mentioned the fact that certainly the O'Neills at Edenduff Carrick managed to retain an estate there, but much of South and East Antrim comes into the possession of Sir Arthur Chichester. Chichester, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, the single most important official in Ireland in the early 17th century, through various schemes and strategies, carves out for himself a huge estate in the south of the county. Of course, he acquires where Belfast is now. He acquires Carrickfergus, Isla McGee, a huge swathe of land in the 6 Mile Water Valley. And you can see by 1611 it was noted that there are already many English families, some Scots, and divers civil Irish planted. That's from Carew's survey of the unofficial plantation from 1611. While over at Antrim town itself, we have the Clotworthys. Like Chichester, they're a family from the southwest of England, from Devon. And the Clotworthys established a base where Antrim town is now. And this is an amazing survival from that early period. It's called the Masserine Wolfhound, and it's believed to have been carved in 1612. It's now on display in the Clotworthy Art Centre. So you've got various different blocks of land and settlements emerging at various different places across Antrim and Down. So Hamilton Montgomery in North East County Down, Chichester in much of South and East County Antrim, Clotworthy over at Antrim Town, Macdonald in North Antrim, Bagnall at Newry. And yet even so, much of land is still, in the early 1600s, remaining in Irish ownership. Vastly reduced, of course, and beginning through various processes to be diminished even further. Much of it through, for example, being mortgaged by the lords such as McGuinness and McCartan, some lands sold outright. So in the early 1600s we do see a diminishing in the amount of land remaining in Irish ownership. And that of course will have implications in terms of settlement patterns. So Bob sums it up as follows. There are a number of processes which affected the land ownership of Antrim and Down in the early 17th century. Some of the processes facilitated colonisation, some not. Generally speaking, it was only where ownership change had taken place that substantial colonisation followed. Okay, in other words, it really had to be change in terms of land ownership that resulted in settlers moving on to new lands. So in areas that remained in Irish ownership, almost no settlement at all from Britain, but obviously in places like the Hamilton Montgomery settlements, substantial and significant settlement. We can see this from the distribution map based on the Muster Roll of 1630, and John Johnston will be speaking in more detail about that in a moment. But you can see quite clearly the contrast between the very, very heavy settlement in North East County Down on the Hamilton and Montgomery settlements in this area. North Antrim, where MacDonald introduces significant numbers of Scots to his lands. And yet, over in the west, you can see where much of it, the settlement is rather thin on the ground. And of course, in places in south and west, County Down, for example, no settlement is recorded. Some of the estates now, it must be said, there aren't surviving muster rolls. But you can see clearly areas where there was very heavy settlement and areas where it was really not affecting the landscape at all. Now, one of the other changes that we see in the early 1600s was the development, the active development of an urban network. Certainly there had been towns in Ulster prior to the 17th century. Carrickfergus, for example, had been a significant town since the late 12th century. You had Gaelic towns and settlements such as Cavan, Cavan town, which was a Gaelic market town of some significance. But by and large, the network of towns that we see today was very much a product of innovations in the 17th century. Nearly all of these towns have been established at places of importance in the pre-plantation world, but we see their active development in the 1600s. Bangor, of course, had been a settlement or a place of importance for over 1,000 years because of its strong ecclesiastical connections. But in the early 1600s, we see Sir James Hamilton actively developing it as a town. And this is a beautiful map, a Raven map of 1625. And you can see the town, if you recognise Bangor, if you know Bangor, you will still recognise it today. This is the road, say, sweeping in from Belfast. Bangor Abbey is up here. You come down to the seafront. You note, for example, the rabbit warren here. Rabbit's been a source of food, for instance. Note the ball green down here. So Hamilton's providing for the recreational needs of the townspeople. And you can see up here, this is the house that James Hamilton built as his home, standing in sight now of where the council offices in North Down Museum are located. And of course, with towns comes urban society. And we see the beginnings of a society based on living in towns, trading with other towns, trading overseas. And they have that, of course, produced various needs. Who's going to run the towns? How are they operated? Well, we see in 1612, 1613, a significant number of charters issued to towns across Ulster. And in many ways, these mark the beginnings of municipal government in these towns. We see corporations established. In many ways, they bear no resemblance at all to town councils today. But yet we do see, you can see the beginnings of urban government. This, for example, is a wonderful tombstone in Bangor Abbey to Thomas Bradshaw. And it's what was on the opening slide of my talk. But you can see the three figures here carved in relief in postures of praying, hands clasped in prayers. You see the mortality symbols down below, very typical of monuments of their day. Bradshaw, you can see the date 1620. And Bradshaw is described as a sometime baillie of Bangor. And baillie is probably referring to the Scottish, one of the Scottish meanings of the term, as a municipal magistrate. In other words, he is someone who had authority in the town. He was a corporation official charged with various tasks. This is wonderful survival from that period. It's one of the finest monuments of the early 1600s. Now, some towns fared better than others. At Dunluce, for example, Randall MacDonald, who's very keen to introduce new ideas, innovations. He builds, for example, a wonderful manor house in the English style at Dunluce. And so he attempts to develop a town, but his town fails. The problem was, it was too close to rival towns such as Coleraine, for example, and it was not positioned where there was a natural harbour. So it's a town that is described in 1611 as laid out in the manner of the Pale, in other words, laid out like towns in the Dublin area. It more or less disappears. It's a vanished town, a lost settlement. So archaeologists in recent years have actually been working to uncover this town. You can see, for example, here, a cobbled street. Okay, and you can see the drain running along that street. Here you can see the foundations of a substantial house, a merchant's house. This, for a brief time, this was a place of some importance, and yet is gone today. But hopefully, when the work is complete, when the topsoil has been uncovered, we will have a wonderful picture of what this town looked like. I mean, you can see they didn't have to dig down very far to actually reach the street. You know, barely a foot of topsoil had to be removed to reveal that. Another change, innovation, you might say, was the introduction of a new religion to Ulster, Protestantism. And while the Reformation in Ireland could be said in an official sense at any rate to date back to the 16th century, in reality, until you actually have settlement, settlers coming in from Britain, it really made very little difference on the ground. And where Protestantism took hold, and where you do see churches built and congregations established, it really primarily is in areas where settlement was strongest. This is simply an area in East Antrim. Some of the churches that were established at that time, these churches we know to have been in existence in the 1620s and 30s. You can see, for example, some are marked up to indicate that they were founded by, or not founded, but the churches themselves were rebuilt or renovated by Hamilton, some by Montgomery, in their estates in North and East County Down. Other churches, for example, like Larne, Ballycarry, I'll mention in a moment. In North Antrim, we also see numbers of churches established. And here, interestingly, they're established by Randall MacDonald. Curiously enough, since he himself was a Catholic, and yet he built and established Protestant churches and allowed Protestant ministers to come in for the benefit, you might say, of the settlers on his estate. So MacDonald plays a very canny game. He's a very, very shrewd individual. He loses nothing of his Highlands and Islands background. He himself retains his Catholicism, and yet he adapts very well to the changed situation in the early 1600s. You can see two of the tombstones of these early ministers. Edward Bryce, who's regarded as the first Presbyterian minister in Ireland, came across to Ballycarry in 1613. Or Josias Welch, his tombstone, he died in 1634, grandson of John Knox. You can still see those monuments today. And I mentioned, for example, the innovations in religion, the new religion, but the old religion continues as well. Brian McCurta has done a great study of the survival and revival, in fact, of Catholicism in early 17th century Ulster. And here, for example, you can see Bunamargy. I mentioned MacDonald, who builds Protestant churches on this estate, and yet at Bunamargy, he renovates the friary there, and it becomes a base for the Franciscan mission to Scotland, taking Catholicism back into Scotland. MacDonald also becomes a patron of St. Patrick's Purgatory, for instance. What we see here, this is the wing he builds on to Bunamargy. That remained, or that was built as his own private burial vault, his family's burial vault. They lie in the vault beneath this. And you might say this was a private mortuary chapel above. You can see built in the Jacobean style. Or down below, here we have the door in the South Church at Loughin Island. And you can see on it P. McC. McCartan, this is built by one of the McCartans in 1636. Okay, and you can see the wonderful doorway here. You can see something of the influence of Renaissance architecture in it. And look at this doorway at Tullynickhill. This church was renovated about, well, I think it's 1639 is here. Stands on the Hamilton estate, so maybe Sir James Hamilton had something to do with it. But you can see they're almost identical. So architectural styles are certainly not associated with any one religious grouping. You see the mixing of influences. You see the continuity of the old and the innovation of the new. So hopefully that's given you an overview of what was happening in Antrim and Down in the early 17th century and how that differs from what was happening in the west of the province, and some of the continuities with the past and the changes brought about as a result of those settlements. So thank you very much.
But I was asked today, just in the next few minutes, to introduce several types of plantation records. I'm going to use examples specifically from the PRONI collections. Now, a bit of a disclaimer, I wouldn't count myself as an expert, but I have been afforded a chance basically to look through some of these records and to look at the contents of such. Those who know me know that when I speak, I usually draw a lot of the information from the records. And it's really for you to paint a picture in your imagination of plantation society, families, and the context in which they came. So I'm going to start with a quote directly from a record, and it's really the call to plant. So here we go. If you see me frowning, you know that it's the early 17th century English. Art thou rich, possessed with much revenue? Make speed without racking of rents or other offensive means. Thou shalt do God and thy prince excellent service. Art thou a tradesman, a smith, a weaver, a mason, or a carpenter? Go hither, thou shalt be in estimation, and quickly enriched by thy endeavours. Art thou a minister of God's word? Make speed, the harvest is good, but the labours be few. Thou shalt there see the poor ignorant, untaught people worship stones and sticks. Art thou a gentleman that takest pleasure in hunt? The fox, the wolf, the woodkern do expect thy coming, and the comely well-cabazed stag will furnish thy feast with a full dish. And an interesting quote at the end of this, which really puts into context the call to plant. There thou shalt have elbow room. Now, this statement can be found among the notes of the plantation expert, the late R.J. Hunter, whose research papers have been deposited here at PRONI. The statement is drawn from a pamphlet entitled A Direction for the Plantation in Ulster by Thomas Blennerhassett, dated about 1610, which is now preserved in the British Library. So it represents the material that Bob brought together under one roof now here in the Public Record Office. It provides a guide for plantation. And it notes the securing of that wild country to the Crown of England, the withdrawing of all the charge of the garrison and men of war, the rewarding of the old servitors to their good content, the means how to increase the revenue to the Crown with the yearly very great sum, how to establish the purity of religion there, and how the undertakers may with security be enriched. So it really acts as an appeal to fellow Englishmen and their families to support the Ulster scheme, and it represents the material brought together for that scheme that's held here. So in a sense it's a piece of promotional literature. Over 100 boxes of Bob's handwritten notes and tracings are deposited, so there's a wealth of information. Just drawing from one, again for the scheme, it relates to the project for plantation, and as William has noted, the official project being in the counties of Tyrone, Coleraine, Donegal, Fermanagh, Armagh and Cavan. Now, the notes that Bob had taken are important relating to the colony for several reasons. The state of the organisation in which the formal plantation would take, and it's of benefit to us really to understand the types of people and families coming. First, English and Scottish, who are to plant their portions with English and Scottish tenants. Second, servitors in Ireland, who may take English or Irish tenants at their choice. And natives who are to be found as freeholders. The documents are also all marked with the initials EM, which some of you may have realised is those of Edmund Midhop, a government official of that time. And it really indicates the role of civil administration in the initial part of the project. Bob's handwritten notes make a clear distinction, as William had mentioned, between the administered scheme in the west of Ulster and the informal colonisation of East Ulster. And I'll quote from some of his handwritten notes really that expresses this. The planning of the colony for the 6 confiscated counties occupied more than 2 years, so that when the settlers arrived in the second half of 1610, they were fitted into this devised structure. Antrim and Down were not included in the official plantation plan. In the 16th century, they were not ruled by the great Gaelic lords, but by numerous smaller lords. At the end of the war in 1603, many of these lords were confirmed in possession of their lands, but some were subsequently forced to sell part of them through indebtedness. They found ready markets in Scots and English men keen to avail of new opportunities in Ulster at a time when the main plantation scheme was not yet conceived. So a term like that really demonstrates how Bob really brought together the emphasis of East and West so eloquently. An agreement between the Lords of the Privy Council as the King's relatives, or representatives, and Randall MacDonald as Lord of the Glynns, which I must say can't be a bad thing, refers to the boundary drawn between the official plantation in the west and the remaining counties in the east, where MacDonald surrendered 9 townlands adjoining Coleraine to the Crown for the furtherance of the plantation of Ulster. So it really demonstrates how this border was fluid at that time, and even in the administration of that border. I'm sure you come to this topic either interested in family history, local history, or the significance of the plantation from an historical point of view. But I would like to introduce a few plantation records held by PRONI, including transcriptions from official 17th century sources, original early modern manuscripts, just to reveal them as evidence for the plantation, their evidential value for you, and to demonstrate how, as records, they reveal something of plantation families and the environment they created. The first one is that which the Planters Society inherited. The planters who looked to East Ulster for investment opportunities and profit acquired the physical remnants of that earlier colony that William had presented. And a document held here in transcript form from the Sir Thomas Smith papers, dated the 27th of July 1572, describes Sir Thomas's environs in the colony of Ards and North Down, which is about 31 years before the end of the 9 Years' War. And again I quote from the record. I, the said Thomas Smith, now have manors, lordships, castles, monasteries, abbeys, priories, chantries, free chapels, houses, buildings, lands, chases, parks, warrens, lakes, services, churches, tithes, wards, marriages, reliefs, and commodities, whatsoever with all and singular in the great and little Ards Clanleyboy. So really, it brings to life that which the planters, the landscape that the planters inherited. This Anglo-Norman settlement, described by Smith, really provided the Crown with a claim to the title of most of Antrim and Down, and makes the difference between East and West, where administrative structures in the East survived well into the 17th century, shaping the informality of the scheme itself. Although East Ulster was free from formal government regulation in one sense, officials who administered the state kept concise records on households settled in Antrim and Down, and it's from this that we gather information on the families that lived in Ulster or East Ulster on this occasion. Despite the fact that the patent rolls from the reign of James I have since been destroyed, printed calendars of these rolls, which were prepared by the Irish Record Commission in 1833, have been used by historians such as the Reverend Stewart in the early 1900s to identify those who were given grants of intermediary status or denization. And through this process, a settler could purchase land which he could then bequeath to his family. Now, a settler could also become naturalised, placing them in the same position as the native-born subject. So examples. Examples of Scottish families in this instance are evident in Stewart's transcriptions from the rolls, and this can be found in transcribed form here in PRONI. And just states, in naturalisation, to be freed from the yoke of servitude of the Scottish or Irish nation and enjoy all the rights and privileges of English subjects, dated the 20th of May 1617. So you can imagine the list of the head of households in the area that were being naturalised into being a subject of the state. And just picking a few family names: William Shaw of Donaghadee, Thomas Agnew of Grey Abbey, the Cunninghams, the Kelsos of course, the Semples and the Montgomerys of Carrickfergus. Also listed are letters patent of denization, which is a transition between being planter and being a subject. They're dated the 12th of February 1619, and there we find Patrick Hamilton and Eliza, his wife, of Bangor, Paul Reynolds, Rachel Carmichael of Ballywalter, and it's quite rare to find a lady listed, the Kennedys, and John Barber, listed as preacher of the Word of God. The undertakers were required to occasionally muster. I'm not going to say much about mustering because John's going to speak about that. But mustering was really to assemble Protestant tenants and others, being able-bodied and capable of military service, for inspection by the Muster Master General, which is a great title, I think, for occupation. The officials created muster rolls by estate, arranged the names, the ages and the types of arms, if any, borne by the tenants. And several transcriptions are here in PRONI also, where they list the names of the men of the principal landlords who could assemble. They date to 1618, 1630 and 1642. And just to pluck a few names from the Stewart transcriptions for Sir Hugh Montgomery's estates in 1618, they include Logan, Adair, Fraser, Bailey and Shaw. So it's identifying these families or head of households living in that area at that time. Government officials who required information on particular areas in the 17th century also had an interest in East Ulster, where they assembled juries composed of local men who were charged with investigating matters of land ownership, inheritance or lease policy. And the Ulster Inquisitions, as they were termed, are an invaluable source, as the names of the tenants on individual estates are there listed, especially those who acted as jurors within those investigations. One example is the jurors drawn from an inquisition relating to lands of the Lord Bishop of Down, held in Downpatrick on the 13th of January 1620. As you can see there again, it's drawing the names of people and where they're living. There's Henry Savage of Arkeen near Portaferry. There's Brian McHugh McGuinness, Tullymore near Newcastle. On down you see Edmund Duff Fitzwilliam of the Grange and Con McClanahan of Drumbeg there at the bottom, and there's a variety of different names, usually the townland where they were living. Next, in 1622, a survey carried out by commissioners appointed by the government during an inquiry into the conditions and success of the official plantation scheme drew out some submissions for the 6 confiscated counties, but they also made some comparison notes in transcript form relating to estates along the fringes of the eastern parts, the eastern-western border between the 2 parts of Ulster. Notes taken from Bob's own records, which he had undertaken in the National Library of Ireland, provided description of the strongholds where undertakers and their families lived. So in one example, a comparison between the household of 2 brothers who lived at either side of this fringe can be identified. So the first is a submission by the prominent undertaker in the Fuse barony in County Armagh, just over the county border into Bessbrook, and it's that of Sir Archibald Atchison, and it provides a full description of his defended stronghold and associated buildings, as well as a list of his arms. It gives us all the context where these families were living. So I'll read a portion from that. There is a stone bawn, all foot thick in the wall. Item upon the east side of the said bawn is built a stone house, having 4 stacks of brick chimneys. In the rest of the bawn is built about with low thatched houses once gifted. Items without the gate is built a malt house and kiln of stone, a water mill, barns and other houses all thatched. Item in the manor house there is now 52 pikes, 25 horsemen's staves, 12 muskets, 2 pairs of long wrought work pistols, 2 pairs of short snap work pistols, 14 targets, 6 bows, 2 halberts, 2 two-handed swords, 12 other swords, a drum and collars. So it really gives an indication of the centre of the community being held at the bawn, or the defended household. It's not really safe in my view, basically, to assume that Atchison's stronghold is described approvingly by the commissioners. But in a small note at the very bottom, they say that Atchison's house is a convenient dwelling house. And towards the bottom of the submission, he says, or the commissioner says, that the neighbouring barony of Ivey, outside territory, the buildings of Brother Henry were found inadequate. And it goes on to say that the bawn was substantial, but there was neither gate nor house within it. And the direct quote, of no use and regarded so ill built. So it's really a comparison of 2 brothers on either side of this fringe. In my view, it's government propaganda, and I think the conditions of planters' buildings and where their families were living may have fallen between the 2 extremes. Now, I put up this slide just of a few of the original manuscripts, etc., that are held in PRONI, and I'll refer to some of them. But of a special interest and value, I think, to family, local historians and those interested in the history of early 17th century Ulster. I think both legal and pecuniary records are of great value. Now, they include commercial papers, dowries through marriage, leases and agreements, which reveal more about the plantation families in East Ulster. An initiative between PRONI and the National Archives has arranged digital access to the state papers relating to Ireland for visitors to PRONI. And although the majority of the documents are concerned with the administration of Ireland between 1509 and 1670, fragments of information on migrating families can be found, and they're evident. One includes that of Ludovic Thompson, merchant of the borough of Belfast, where he's being granted naturalisation from Lower Germany. So there's that connection of coming from Lower Germany to Belfast. And it gives him the power to create property in 1624. Sir Arthur Chichester made proposals towards the establishment of towns as the focal point for the colony, and found within the local authority archives here at PRONI a printed copy of the charter granted by James I, creating the borough of Belfast, dating to 1613 can be found. Now, the charter established a corporation consisting of a sovereign and 20 free burgesses. And Ludovic Thompson there is noted as the sovereign between 1631 to 2 and again from 1634 to 5. He was later removed as a burgess in 1642 for having been out of the kingdom for 6 years. Two major concerns for planters were the preservation of their estates and provisions for their younger sons. And the fate of younger sons was often by arrangement within the family, and these arrangements reveal something of the nature of the family structure. Sir Hugh Montgomery's second son, Sir James, was granted land near Grey Abbey, County Down, and this same grant notes that he acknowledges himself well contented and never to seek or crave any further of his father's possessions or proceed any way in the prejudice of his father's heir. So in doing that, he identifies the different generations. And similar to England and lowland Scotland, Ulster families were often the source of loans, safe mortgages, and they were often attributors in disputes. As a result, evidence for family relations can also be identified. From one note from Bob from the Hamilton manuscripts, he reveals a dispute over demised premises, which acted as a dowry between Sir James Hamilton and William Kelso. And obviously the lights went off when I found that. And it was on a marriage between Sir James's daughter and that of Kelso. The grant included the royalties, tithes, woods, anchorages, ferry and full liberty of the town of Ballymacarrat. And by coincidence, this is the townland of Ballymacarrat that we're standing in. They were later found to be in the possession of the Pottinger family in 1622 without any explanation. So the dispute is noted there within the manuscripts, and it wasn't settled until a lease was issued by the Right Honourable Henry on the 16th of September 1669 to one John Kelso, which presumably is William's successor. So the generations are also noted there. And when Patrick Savage of Portaferry was unable to pay an instalment on the dowry of his sister Maria to Cacalog O'Hara, it was his father-in-law, Viscount Ards, who granted the substantial loan. So again, the relationships between the generations can be revealed. Members of the wider family living on an estate were often bound by their landlord by lease. And you know Ian will mention leases in relation to Antrim later on. But it's pivotal to research lease material. And in essence, the lease acted as a contract under which the landholder would provide land often to family members and their tenants. So the family member as a middle tenant in return for rent in cash or a combination of cash and kind. And a lease made in 1632 explains the financial responsibilities executed by one cousin upon another. The said Rory, and this is the McGuinness family, for himself of his heirs, doth hereby covenant, promise and grant, and with the said Donald, during the said term, discharged of and from all manner of former contracts, bargains, sales, fiefments, jointures, dowers, statute tables, recompenses, forfeitures, still warrant, acquit and defend the said Donald, paying the rents, doing and performing all, and whatsoever herein contained, which on his part is to be performed and done. I'd like to finish by highlighting a letter which you can see in the centre of the slide. It's a letter from James Hamilton, the first Viscount Clandeboy, to Piers Tumulty, dated the 29th of April 1629, and I think it's one of my favourite records within the 3 million that we hold. And it's about the terms in which the Portaferry to Strangford Ferry would run. And it demonstrates the most common relationship maintained between families of Ulster, that of landlord or grantor, and the other of tenant and grantee. So although it's only 12 records that I mention, there's hundreds for you to access here at the offices and elsewhere. And the ones that I introduce really only give you quick snippets of instances within early 17th century society. There's lots of examples to find. The project of plant families, drawn from the orders and conditions of the plantation scheme that Bob gathered together, can be revealed. The environs settled and formed by families are revealed there by inquisitions and surveys. The migration of families are noted also through naturalisation and official sources. The financial responsibilities of families are there in official manuscripts of disputes, marriages, dowries, loans and leases. And the relationships maintained between families as grantor and grantee are there also. So there's a wealth of material to access. And I'd encourage you all, and even challenge you all basically, to visit PRONI for yourself and to witness the wealth of plantation sources held in our care. And thank you very much for listening.
First of all, Sam, thank you for that. William Roulston, ladies and gentlemen, was mentioning about Scots travelling between Germany and Ulster and the other way around. I feel in the same position. It's one of the things to remember when we're looking at migration in Scotland in particular. Scottish migration is going in two directions. It's going into Ireland and also going into northern Germany and into the Baltic. And in some ways, a lot of the interplay which we'll see comes out. We think of the Hamiltons, for example, down at Menay in County Fermanagh, who are also related to the Hamiltons who are the Lords of Gotland in southern Sweden. But this is to look now at one particular document that comes out. Glynn Kelso mentioned the fact that there were regular musters held in Ulster. The planters were required to hold convenient stores of arms. And the convenient store of arms was defined as, for every 1,000 acres of land, 6 pikes and 6 calivers or muskets. Caliver is a matchlock. It's a shortened version of a musket. They're matchlock, so there's very simple mechanism. And the basic idea was that this would arm half the men on the estate. Remember, the requirement is for them to have 24 men drawn from 10 families. So a father and 2 elder sons. Which means when the families are arriving around 1610, 1615, the father will be in his 40s and the younger of the sons will be about 18. The muster roll which we have here is essentially a record of who the people were, taken 20 years later. So we have the 1610, the Jacobean surveys that take us through to 1622. This is a linked document 20 years on. But I think it's going very much an important source for information on individual families, and really that's what I want to look at. Great. This is just an example here taking one particular estate, the estate of Henry Upton. just north of Temple Patrick. And if we look through that list of names, what we can see is how the names have been spread. We're finding Alexander MacCulloch, that's McCulloch, Andrew Crawford, Nicholas Norris, Scottish names, English names, John Mark, Thomas Cuddy, actually probably pronounced as Thomas Caddy, it's a Welsh name. McAllister, notice all the names have been written phonetically. And we're then getting William Eggles, again a Welshman. These are people whose names are coming into play, they're turning up, essentially being recorded. Because every 6 months, the tenants had to muster with arms, and the muster was to be carried out and then checked by the Muster Master General, or to be more precise, by the Muster Masters. There was one for the north, who basically was Leinster, and for Ulster, and one for the south, Connaught and Munster. The 1618 muster was carried out and checked by George Allen, who is the Muster Master. Allen finds a massive outbreak of personation. Those of us who remember plays like Over the Bridge will note that personation is not a new phenomenon in Ulster. Very prominent there, and the net result is, to stop personation, the Muster Masters write down the names of the men who muster. The muster which we have here is giving us the lists of names. And this is the county totals for the muster records that were completed between the spring of 1629 and the spring of 1633. Muster is conducted by William Graham, who is a member of one of the servitor families. The Grahams themselves have land, actually, what becomes Bourne Boy in County Cavan. Graham goes from his family estate, an estate which he's leased just outside Rosslea in County Fermanagh, and he travels around the province making a list of who those people whom he sees at the musters each spring. The local muster would have been carried out by the local landlord, and one presumes that the letter was then sent down to Dublin saying, yes, I've mustered my tenants and everything's correct and aren't I a good boy? What Graham in fact exposes is some of the inadequacies. And in spring 1634 he compiles from his list of names a summary document which is called the Breviate. That is the document he presents to the Lord Deputy, Sir Thomas Wentworth. Wentworth takes one look at it and says, this is but a company of naked men, armed with birding pieces. And the birding piece actually is what he's actually referring to is one of the particular types of firearm, which is the snap hands. Very expensive, it's the early form of the flintlock, it's an expensive weapon, prestige item, and so we can also work out then something, those people who had that, it's effectively saying, I got the new iPhone. So it's the equivalent thing, it's a statement of social status, of wealth. And from that we can get an awful lot of information from the muster roll that perhaps isn't immediately obvious. What I should add is that the bit of the muster roll that most people will encounter is the Breviate, because that's the bit that, for example, Raymond Gillespie published in his study of settlement in East Ulster. It's also the bit that Bert Robinson published in his study of settlement plantation of Ulster. But the detailed book was actually not really completed because it's a series of manuscript transcripts. One of the great things that Robert Hunter did was actually to bring that together, and he had much of the work in fact completed just before his death in 2007. So let's look now in more detail of actually what's happening. And what we see here is actually where settlement is taking place. But now look, we mentioned Antrim and Down. Almost a third of all the 13,000 men who muster are located around Strangford Lough. This is pre-plantation settlement. Notice also this large number is clustered up here in North Derry, in North Donegal, and also the large numbers around Derry, spreading down into Tyrone. We've also this huge number here up in the estates of the Earl of Antrim, but very few down here, only about a quarter of the entire population down here in South Ulster. That becomes important when we're then looking at the depositions from 1641. Nicholas Canny's made the point that there is a discrepancy between the information in the muster roll and the information we get of family names in the deposition. What's actually happening in South Ulster, which is where most of the dispositions are coming from, is that people are moving from these overcrowded estates up here down into the vacant lands in the southern counties. Bill Crawford has pointed, for example, to the huge land market that develops in North Donegal in the 1630s. The hunger for land leads to people moving from one place to the other. The estates themselves, that's the pattern, and it's very much the image that William has already shown, the great cluster of settlement around Loch Earn, down along the road down from Cavan, from Belturbet, effectively down towards Virginia. This great cluster in the North Armagh, the Clocker Valley, but again around Loch Swilly, in the Lagan, along the north coast, down the Bann, and then into South Antrim and around Strangford Lough. Those blobs there are the estates of the Earl of Antrim, which William Graham, the man who compiled the muster, duly notes amount to half the county. I think that gives an indication of just how big the Antrim estate really is. If we're looking though at family origins, we can go through the list of names and we can relate the names back to origin, place of origin in England and in Scotland and Wales. But I'd like just to turn to look at some of these names in a bit more detail. First of all, those coming from this area here, from what is effectively now Strathclyde, the region of Scotland, that's pre-plantation migration. It's mostly into North Antrim and also into the around Loch Swilly, down towards Lifford. These are Gallowglass families who've moved in and settled. And in a sense, they're still there when the plantation happens. They're Scots. It's Scottish landlords coming in, for example, around Letterkenny and around Raphoe. Very simple. They already know the people who are there. The MacDonalds, yes, it's MacDonald country. We're finding people like the McNaughtons, for example, turning up. And with the McNaughtons, one of the interesting details there is that the family's legend is that they actually had to flee to Ireland to escape the wrath of the Campbells. They put one over on the Campbells, so the family fled to Ireland. And that is on in the McNaughton clan record. This is how the family ended up with an Irish branch. We also have a large settlement from Ayr, Lanark, really from the central belt of Scotland. And that's where Mike Maxwell's work in the early 1970s becomes important. He's actually shown that this is people driven by land hunger. People like Montgomery and Hamilton are offering land. Fast forward to the 18th century, it's the same motivation we're going to see for people migrating then. It's where there's a shortage of land, people will take the opportunity. So we're getting very enterprising, innovative, potentially innovative people coming into Ulster. And this may explain why, for example, a Catholic landlord like Randall MacDonald will happily accept lowland Scots. It's certainly something which is very unusual in Scotland for a Highlander to trust anybody from south of the Highland line. It's a matter of principle. And speaking of distrust, we then come to one group, the people from the borders, whose arrival in Ulster is, to put it mildly, a result of the union of the crowns. The borders is the debatable land. The families go on raiding parties either side, and as long as England and Scotland are not united, well, it doesn't really matter, get on with it. It's a good form of pacification. James VI first arrives, and he decides, in his own words, to chastise the naughty people. The chastisement is what's called jebra justice, which means we hang you first, and we'll sort out trial and charges sometime later. And right at the start, we find 1605, we find the Grahams, the leading border clan, up at Eskdale. They get rounded up and transported to be settling in Roscommon. Roscommon doesn't work, and so they end up drifting back onto the lands of two members of the family who've already settled there. One of them's the father of William Graham. That's all in Kildare and in Laois, and in fact, and in Wicklow. And if you go into the Irish telephone directory today, you'll find those names are quite common. They're actually that's where the names are to be found. Graham is actually comparatively rare in Northern Ireland. In the North of Ireland, it's comparatively rare. The Grahams are not. The one thing that the administration is going to do is not going to let these people come together to form a potential security threat. So Arthur does not trust them that far. But what we do find is large numbers of these families moving out because of the potential threat of being strung up. And they move in, as we know, very much into Fermanagh and into South Ulster. That is part and parcel thing. The reason they move into South Ulster is because we get two leading members of the borders. We get Sir Gerald Lowther. The Lowthers are one of the leading families in Cumberland. He acquires the estates of two English undertakers in North Fermanagh, who've basically gone broke. He appoints Christopher Irvine. The Irvines are another leading border family as his agent. And suddenly we have a huge magnet drawing these people into North Fermanagh, and they sort of just spread out from there. We've also then got a large settlement from northwest England. We're against land hunger driving it. This is where we're getting enclosed, but that's also the recruiting ground for the Elizabethan army. And so as people, knowing that there's an attractive area to settle, being able to move out. A similar pattern can be found here in the Welsh Marches and in the Midlands. I mentioned about the phonetic spellings like Eggles. We find the names Jones is spelled Joans, and we find Evans is spelled Evans. That's very much the spelling that you'll find, the way that the names are pronounced along the North Wales coast and down in the Dee Valley. So from even the way the names are spelled, we can actually identify the origins, the place of origins of the settlers, perhaps more precisely than we realise. I should add, by the way, that also we find some of the names are actually written in the Welsh style. Again, just taking a couple of examples from sort of Cavan and Fermanagh, we find at Belturbet, there's two guys called Ap Hugh, not Pew, Ap Hugh, which is the Welsh form. We find in Enniskillen, there's a father and son. The father, Ap Eri, the son, Perry. The names become anglicised. The other big area for recruitment, of course, London, East Anglia and the home counties, and that's very much a case of consortium migration. And here, this is where Robert Hunter actually did a lot of very interesting work. Glynn Kelso mentioned the fragments. Some of the fragmentary work that Robert had done, for example, settlement in Fermanagh, English settlement in Fermanagh and Cavan, was to find that how the English undertakers, who are not well off, actually organise things. In fact, they're the chairman of joint stock companies. And the leading tenants, the freeholders and so on, will be recruited from the same home area. So for example, we get them from Norfolk, moving as a group. Robert Bogus is effectively the chairman of the board, as it were. He becomes the undertaker. His freeholders are all from the same sort of parish, the same group of parishes. And that is one of the features which we find with the English settlement. But if we're talking about London, well, there we find the London companies, and one of the things that they're doing effectively is they're using Ireland as a great piece of social welfare work. The Drapers Company, for example, recruits people to settle in Moneymore, and the Drapers Papers are actually here in the Public Record Office. They actually note that they're going to clear the debts of several of their members on condition that they go to Ireland. Who said assisted immigration is an 18th century, 19th century invention? This one here is then showing the distribution of Campbells. I mentioned about how names crop up. Look at that there. Those are the 30 families, are the Gallaglass families who settled there around Lough Swilly as the dowry of Inindu. Inindu's the mother of Reggie O'Donnell, and she brings as part of her dowry a company of Gallaglass, well, the Campbells. We find them spreading over here into Derry, well, they're actually clustered around the city, and on the estates of Sir Robert McClelland. One of the planters originally granted lands in Donegal. That proves to be ineffective. He takes on the lease with the haberdashers just outside Coleraine, and he brings with him many of his tenants. We find, though, this huge clump here around Strangford Lough. This is, again, is pre-plantation settlement. It's Campbells, probably from around the mouth of the Clyde, from the Isle of Arran and the like, moving on to the Montgomery and the Hamilton estates, and then spreading upwards into County Antrim. If you go through the Muster Roll lists of names, Campbell names and names of clans like McCullers associated with the Campbells don't really occur north of the 6 Mile Water. They are not welcome in MacDonald country. Lowlanders, yeah, okay, we can trust them. Campbells, no way. That's also possibly why the 3 here are effectively located in the town of Strabane and in the estates of Sir William Stewart. In other words, it's overspilled from Donegal. But notice that down here, County Cavan, 4 members of the Campbell family to be found. 1 is in Belturbet, and the other 3 are at Killashandra, on the estates of Francis Hamilton. Francis Hamilton is from the Hamiltons of County Donegal, of Killelea. And so we're seeing here how the landlord becomes very, very important in drawing people. But really, what this case with the Campbell estate shows is just how important these hotspots are. These pre-plantation hotspots are really important when we're looking at the movement of families. I mentioned the border families moving into Fermanagh, and if you read William Copeland Trimble's History of Enniskillen, it gets a very heavy dose on it. What actually it isn't obvious is that there are as many border families on the Montgomery and Hamilton estates in County Down as there are in the whole of South Ulster. In other words, a lot of the migration of Scots has already taken place before the plantation has actually happened. And yes, I will agree with Robert Hunter, we have to put plantation with a capital P when we're speaking of west of the Bann, but I think we should use plantation with a small p, as anyone would in the 17th century, to refer to colonisation. Let's now look in more detail. I mentioned the estate of Henry Upton at Templepatrick. That's the list of Templepatrick family names. I have not put up the entire muster roll. It's about 9, it's just over 100 men muster, and this is just turning the names into modern terminology. Some of the names, like Welsh for example, don't appear. The muster roll is not complete. We shouldn't imagine it's a complete survey, it's not. But look at those names, most of them you would find easily in any Ulster town today. But have a look again, we're finding also here, we're finding a lot of Highlanders and Lowlanders moving in. We're seeing this movement of people onto estates. We're also finding some very interesting examples of how we're getting names like Verney, Welsh name. That's probably a family originally soldiers in Henry Upton's company. Upton, after all, is one of Chichester's lieutenants and Carrickfergus. So he's basically paid off, his company is paid off. Hi guys, look, let's get to establish ourselves as local landlords. But the real trick now is let's look at the family relationships. What we have here is a group of families. I've just taken some examples. The first one here are the Crawfords. Notice the spelling here, John Crawford. That's very much the Scottish pronunciation. It's also the commonest way in which the name is spelt in the muster roll. Andrew Crawford, John Crawford appear as well. Fathers and sons very often have the same forename. The elder son will normally have the same forename as the father. So in this case here, we can probably assume that John Crawford, with a good Scottish pronunciation, is the father, and John Crawford is the son. We've also got Andrew Crawford with a sword and pike. What's happened at this estate? Henry Upton is not part of the official plantation. Henry Upton's under no obligation to arm his tenants. This is Henry Upton doing it as a good landlord to prove his loyalty. So he's taking probably a few weapons he's got lying around in the manor house, dish them out, first come, first served. What we also find, though, is if we go to the depositions, we find these two characters turning up as leading participants in the massacre of the Irish at Temple Patrick in February 1642. We also find as well, within that these spellings here, Crawford and Crawford, we're seeing anglicisation. Now, again, there's been a lot of discussion about anglicisation in terms of what happens to the Gaelic Irish. But anglicisation is also happening to the Scots. The Scots are also becoming anglicised in terms of, and that spelling of names, that pronunciation of names is perhaps one of the clues to what this process is happening. We're seeing over here the Millers. These are an interesting one. We can't determine whether they're English or Scots. Miller's a pretty common name on both sides of the Eskdale border. But in fact, what we can then do is, we look at the 1641 deposition, we find that Matthew Miller here is born at the end of the 16th century. He survives 1653, which is when he gives his deposition. He's actually the father, or possibly even the grandfather. And these ones here are probably, this is probably one of the sons, and that's probably one of the grandsons. What's interesting, I mentioned about the killing of Nameson. He's resident of Ballycarry. They again are participants in the killing of the Irish at Ballygomartin. So we can actually find out where families have moved to within estates. And this is providing us with linkages back into the whole question of family relationships. What we should have to be careful about, though, and this is a good example of it, is the proximity of names often gives us a clue as to family relationships. Some of the names are listed father and son as elder or younger, but even where that doesn't happen, we can still trace names. And this one just I mentioned about movement of families. Let's use two examples here. The Browns and the Moores. Large cluster of the names up in the north of Antrim on the estates of the Earl of Antrim. When we start tracing, we find them on the Clockworthy estate, just north at Antrim town, and then spreading down onto the estates of Sir Arthur Chichester's tenants, principal freeholders, here in South Antrim. Same pattern occurring, and that's just two examples of the kind of migration pattern we can actually then trace. What we can also do, if we're taking some of the more detailed family names, we can actually find where individual families are moving. For example, we find there's the Blairs, who again are on, well, James Blair on Upton's estate. We find two other Blairs in County Antrim, who are on the estates of the Earl of Antrim. James Blair is on Upton's estate. James Blair also appears in Glenarm Barony. Probably living actually on the Earl's estate itself, possibly as a tenant of the Shores. And then over on Dunluce Barony, we find John Blair. So we're actually there seeing how families move within estates themselves. At this stage I'm now going to switch to the west of the Bann and look at what's happening on the grocer's estate at Eglinton, or Muff as it's known in the 17th century. We're told that there's a 1619, Nicholas Pinner's report says there was built 4 strong houses, lime and stone, well slated. There are 4 more that are built in other places, somewhat further off. There are other houses of lime and stone that are upon the land dispersed. The 1622 Royal Commission reports there's a village called Muff, consisting of 4 stone houses and 2 small timber thatched. There are also 7 stone houses, slated, and 3 other stone houses in building. We go through that list of names. Obviously suggests there's about 17 families. Now suddenly we've got an awful lot more than 17 families. Again, the names are names we'd find in modern Ulster. Actually, a lot of them we can still find in the Eglinton area. But we can also relate in the 1622 to the Raven maps. And from those we can find out who some of the people are. What we find is here, Robert Downes appears as Captain Downes. So he's captain of the trained band. Kilner appears as Captain Kilner. He's not holding military rank, he's actually the captain of the trained band. The London companies are much more insistent than the individual undertakers are that the tenants actually fulfil the terms of the patent. In other words, they're actually formed up as proper organised bodies. And the London companies actually supply the arms. If any of you see the Lord Mayor's Parade in the beginning of November, you'll see the Honourable Artillery Company marching along with the company of pikemen and musketeers. They're actually armed with the weapons that the Ulster planters were supposed to have. They're also, in fact, wearing the same kit, because the companies, as well as arming the artillery, what's now the Honourable Artillery Company, also supplied those weapons to the planters. But here we're finding the sons of John Robertson, who's part of the household, and we're finding William Moore still turning up. One thing to notice, these 2 guys here are armed with a sword and a snap hand. Snap hands, as I said, a weapon they'd have purchased themselves. We're making a statement of how we've come up in the world. And we're talking about family movement. There's a lot more than 17 families. And we can actually then cross-trace families. So we're finding, for example, on the Roulston estate, we're finding William Clifton, sword and snap hands. In Coleraine, we find Richard Clifton, armed with sword, snap hands, and cavalier and bandoliers. We're finding John Harper, and then we also find John Harper, a resident in Derry, so father and son, or which way round. We find the Paynes, Robert and James, and on the Haberdash estate we find John and Edward Payne. So again, this is showing us how we can actually then trace the names across and find relationships within, actually right throughout the province. And one thing is actually with records, we mentioned about tracing it across the whole period. We can do the same using the Hearth Money Roll, and if we do that for the Grocer's estate, what we're finding here, Fonville, which is the parish in which the Grocer's estate is located, we're finding all this group of names. John Torrance there, John Tarrant, is resident in he must in 1630. Carmichael, William Carmichael, there's only one Carmichael in the Muster Roll. He's actually resident at Muster's in Eglinton, but he's now resident down in Macará in the 1660s. We're seeing again this whole pattern of migration within the province is happening, but the Muster Roll is providing us with a linkage document. And so that, in a sense, ladies and gentlemen, is a quick summary of how we can use the Muster Roll as a way of tracing family history right across 3 or possibly 4 generations. And it's in many ways, this is the nearest we've got to a census, and I think it's perhaps therefore one of those documents that is a starting point for any research into the history of families. Thank you.
Early last year, as Sam just indicated there, I was asked by the Ulster Historical Foundation to complete Bob's work on the Ulster Port books for 1612 to 15. Now, you know, to complete it, I mean, it was there, as Sam says, it was ready to go really, and what I had to do was transcribe Bob's transcriptions of the originals, and the originals are upstairs. There's a copy of them here in the records office. As Bob said, let's see, can I work that? Yes. As Bob said, he was looking to get some, I assume, funding for the publication back in the early 80s. That's how long he was sitting there. And he said they're a uniquely surviving group of Irish port books from the early 17th century. The originals are held in by the West Yorkshire Archive Service in the Temple Newsome manuscripts. And the ports that are included are for Derry, Coleraine, Carrickfergus and the Lecale ports, which are the baronies Ardglass and the Lecale barony in Down. But it's a very, very useful source. I mean, as John spoke very well there about some of the issues that you may have with the muster rolls, that they're not complete. I mean, who didn't get up of bed that morning to go to the muster? You know, there are issues like that. And there are similar issues with the reliability of the port books as well. I mean, for example, I mean, Bob spoke about this and he said if you're taking a cargo listing, if you take the cargo listing of a ship that leaves Coleraine or Carrickfergus or somewhere and then goes to Chester, the goods that are listed in Carrickfergus could be very different then to the goods that are listed when it gets to Chester. So I mean, did they lose half their stock on the way over, you know? Or was there a tax involved? And so, I mean, I think, you know, that's what was happening. So there are issues like that, and as I say here, many of the inventories listed in the port books is very annoying. It'll just state unnamed goods or other wares. I mean, what were these other wares? So was it incompetence? I mean, was it 5 o'clock on a Friday, you know, and he just threw in other wares, that's grand, and away I go? Or was there an element of corruption involved? And like most things when you're talking about people, I suspect there was a bit of both involved. As I say, you see, there's a tax on the goods that come in, you know, a port tax, which is normally a shilling to the pound. Now, luxury items like drink or tobacco or sugar or things like that oftentimes had a second tax. So, you know, I suspect that might be the case here, that they were trying to dodge the second tax. Now, as I say, these port books were the records of trade kept by the customs officials at the ports, and as I say, they're not always accurate because, you know, falsified returns or smuggling would have been rife. But the port books at the same time offer, I think, a very valuable indication of the pattern of trade, of the needs of the pioneer colonial society, and it's very interesting to see what's coming into the ports of Ulster. And as well the value set upon various goods in Antrim and Down in the early 17th century. Now, booking European trends of economic distress in the early 17th century, the Irish economy actually improved and began to strengthen following the end of the 9 Years' War in 1603. Its close economic and political ties to England, which didn't suffer as much in the economic downturn then engulfing continental Europe, that also sheltered Ireland economically. And as I say here, the port towns grew dramatically in response to the growth of trade in the early 17th century. A lot of these, you know, like the plantation and the growth in... Now, oh God, it's still going. I must be shut up. That's not your time is up. These port towns grew dramatically as a result of the growth in trade, because more people are coming in, and as people come in, you need shops, you need people who are going to sell various wares and various things. And I mean, you know, in Derry, the trade seemed to pick up quicker and benefit from the plantation in a shorter time frame. That would tie in with what John was saying, that the Derry merchant companies were very interested in pushing, you know, in doing everything by the letter of the law, and the Derry trade seems to pick up very, very quickly. That's actually, as opposed to Coleraine, whose growth seems to have retarded around this time, according to a man who had lost his interest in Coleraine, a guy called Thomas Phillips, so he may have been overstating it slightly. As I say here, Phillips said that prior to the plantation, the Scots resorted thither in great number. For every summer there came between 50 and 60 barks and boats into the Ban, which brought merchandise and carried away timber and boards and other commodities such as the country did yield. And again, this ties in with what John was saying, how there was already a lot of Scottish migration into Ulster, and that this was a continuation of it. Excuse me. Now, Antrim and Down's close links with Britain, but especially with Scotland, are also evident throughout these port books. Michael Percival Maxwell, whose name has been mentioned a few times already today, has stated there can be no question that it was the Scottish settlements that were largely responsible for the flourishing condition of commerce between Scotland and Ulster. In the Lecale ports, as I said, these places like Ardglass, Strangford, Dundrum, Killock and places like that, 56 exported loads between the 29th of January and the 30th of September 1614. 56 loads that are actually in the book. So there could have been others that went off in the middle of the night that no one saw. 10 of these ships that went from Lecale went to Kirkcudbright, 10 went to Ayr, 9 went to Workington, 6 to Whitehorn, Weir and Chester, 3 to Largs, 2 each to Liverpool and Bristol, and 1 each to Tenby and Rosses. So of the 56 loads as well, 28 were from Ardglass, 20 from Strangford, so they were the busiest ports, 6 from Dundrum and 2 from Killock, and the total export value £2,251 and 8 shillings. So that was the amount that left these ports, and you can see that a lot of Scottish interaction there already. Now, a lot of these loads that were leaving Coleraine, or I should say that were leaving Lecale, a lot of livestock, a lot of wheat, a lot of oats, some hides and a small amount of whiskey and tallow. They were the main exports that were leaving Ulster at this time. You can kind of get that from all of the ports really. They're the main things that are coming out. There was so much in terms of cattle and livestock in Ireland at that time, that it's no surprise that there's a lot of it leaving Ireland at that time. And then the wheat and oats as well, and then of course then things that are associated with livestock like the hides and things like that as well. Now, but then some of the things that are coming into Lecale as well, on the 25th of April 1614, from the Speedwell of Liverpool, that was the name of the boat. There's some marvellous names. Gift of God was very popular, that was a big one. Speedwell, that was sometimes, I suppose, in hope rather than expectation. 3,500 spike nails, 12 spades are coming in one of the loads. So this is the construction trade in full flow here. A lot of nails for building, spades for digging. Imported as well into Ardglass in July 1615. These guys have to be fed that are doing the work, and there are kettles coming in, brass kettles, raisins of the sun. There's kind of sun-dried raisins, tobacco, prunes, sugar. So nice. These guys weren't skimping, I suppose. They were living the life. So there's obviously a market for this, because a lot of stuff like this is coming into Ireland. Basically, it's nice kind of refined things that are coming into Ireland, and then what's leaving Ireland are the staple things. The livestock, the grain, that sort of thing. That's what tends to leave Ireland, and what comes in there are these nice things like sun-dried raisins and prunes and sugar and what have you. Now, there was also a lot of stuff coming in to Carrickfergus on the same lines as well. From the 3rd of October 1614 to the 16th of September 1615, Carrickfergus exports 45 loads, again 45 on the books, 45 loads of goods to the value of £3,170, 13 shillings and 8pence. They're exporting huge amounts of barrel staves, salt hides, beef, bacon and tallow. That was one of the other things I should have said as well, the large amount of wood, timber, a large amount of deforestation going on at this time. And so a huge amount of barrel staves are going out. A lot of that tends to go to Bilbao and places down around, the Spanish sort of peninsula, along that sort of direction. And then again, what's coming in? Sugar candy, vinegar, soap, pepper, copper pans, wine, whiskey, thread, hats, pipes, and lots of things like that. These are sort of things. And then things like the hats will be divided up. Hats for children, hats for for women's hats, blue bonnets. You can see the Scottish thing coming through there. And then again, the building trade is in full flow, and they're importing, like, I mean, what, 12,000 slates are worth £3. Wouldn't that be a great bargain? Docked in Carrickfergus in late 1614. So again, you know, a lot of houses that need roofing coming in at this time. And as well, as I say, you know, people wanted, you know, the comforts of home, I suppose, and things like, you know, alcohol, cloth, dyes, like a lot of blue dyes, things like this are coming in. And I just pulled one load just out at random, really, from the Carrickfergus books. And on the 27th of January 1615, the Gift of God of Glasgow's the ship, docked in Carrickfergus, carrying 20 barrels of salt. I'm assuming, you know, for preserving things as well as, you know, sweetener. 100 gallons of whiskey. This was after Christmas, so, you know. Soap to the value of £1. 300 weight of madder. There's this dye at £4. 30 yards of coarse linen cloth. 10 iron pots. That's just one taken at random out of these books, but I think in a lot of ways it kind of represents what is generally happening at this time. Now, I spoke about the amount of livestock leaving the country, and Oliver St. John, who was a plantation officer, he's later viceroy, in 1614, he wrote that great good will come into this kingdom by transporting cattle and corn from hence into England, for this kingdom will be able to spare great quantities of both, which will bring money into it, and make this barbarous nation feel the sweets thereof, for the love of it will sooner effect civility than any other persuasion whatsoever. So he's basically saying, give them a bit of money, they'll get a taste for it and they'll all become civilised. Now, I've never seen money enter an equation and people become civilised, so he was a naive man. Well, I'm from Cavan saying that, so, you know. Livestock and grain are the main goods, as I say, coming out of the northern ports at this time. And what's coming out as well sometimes can be fish as well, are leaving the ports as well. Now, so large were the numbers of cattle being exported across the Irish Sea in the early 17th century that, as I say here, in 1625-26, measures were taken to prevent the export of cattle and cattle products such as hides from Ireland into Scotland. Now, the planters were rarely the cattle farmers themselves producing the livestock for sale. They were the middlemen. They were procuring for sale the cattle normally off the Gaelic Irish, and then they were making a profit on it because they had the contacts, I suppose, back in Scotland or England. So they were able to take them off the Irish hands and do that. As I say again, grain becomes one of the very important exports. And I mean, you know, suddenly it just, the grain exports just jump. And I mean, I don't know if it means that there was more grain actually being grown. I mean, there was a certain amount of deforestation going on, so they were clearing lands. But it also points, I think, to an overhaul in customs duties. You know, it became cheaper to export grain at this time. And it's sold again at a cheaper price than the Scottish and English grain. So the Irish grain is undercutting the British market. And so what the Scottish Council does in 1618, they put a high rate of duty on this Irish grain, and that sort of puts an end to a lot of that exportation. And it also reduces the incentive, I think, to undertake this arable farming in Ulster. I mean, part of the reason for the plantation was, you know, to bring in more kind of, you know, British or Anglicised practices. So to move away from the pastoral farming and move to arable farming. But then this move by the Scottish Council kind of, you know, there wasn't what they call the joined up thinking going on at this time. The only other major non-pastoral product to be exported was linen yarn, and a lot of that, unsurprisingly, is going to Lancashire, Manchester, places like that had a big trade in that sort of thing. Anyway, now the timber trade, as I mentioned there, begins to grow and expand from the 1550s when deforestation begins to happen in earnest throughout the island. But it experiences then a very significant but relatively short-lived period of growth in the early 17th century. And it said in Derry in May 1609 that all materials for the building of ships except the tar is there to be had in great plenty. And they later hoped that Irish timber products could be sold cheaper than those sold by the Dutch, so they were obviously buying off the Dutch at a high price, so they were hoping that the Irish prices could come in cheaper. The Surveyor General in 1637, Charles Monk, said that the woods around Carrickfergus contained the best timber that ever I saw. And he gave off about the fact that this very good timber was being used to make pipe staves and barrel staves and things like this. You know, like that could have been a cheaper kind of, or not as good a quality timber, and instead this very good timber was being used to make something very basic, which again points to the abundance of this high quality woodland in Ulster at this time. Like I say, the amounts of barrel staves, pipe staves, hogshead staves, just literally tons of that leaving Ireland, leaving the Ulster ports at this time, and a lot of that's going as far as Spain. There seems to be a big market for it there, and it's largely depleted by the end of the century. Why? Because a lot of the woodland is gone, so you know it puts an end to that. It's not like now, you know, where you know you often see in things now, for every tree we cut down, you know, we plant two in its place. There was none of that sort of forward thinking at that time. Now, I mention here some of these luxury items. I think these are the things I love seeing coming up in this, because you really get a feel for the human aspect, you know, because sometimes you can go through things and it's like, oh, this was worth £2 or this was worth whatever. But it's lovely then when you get all these great things coming in, like white candy, currants, prunes, figs, these raisins of the sun, and Malaga raisins. So, you know, whoever's buying these, because it's just coming to a certain merchant, so we don't know how he distributes them after that, but you know, these people are relatively prosperous. Again, spices, things, you know, to flavour your foods, like, and you know, these are things that you'll find in any kitchen to this day. In my kitchen, normally unopened. Ginger and nutmeg, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, pepper, licorice, sugar, salt, vinegar, all the things that we would see in any kitchen today. The brass kettles, frying pans, drinking glasses, you know, just these wonderful little tasters of what people wanted at this time, because if they're coming in, there's obviously the market for them. And again, the large amounts of wine, especially from France, some from Spain as well, and then Scottish whisky coming in, Ishka Baja is often, you know, Scottish Aquavita, it comes under those sort of terms, coming into the Ulster ports. So again, you know, they're feeling, you know, the need for the homeland brew, as it were, and you know, they want to get that. And tobacco and pipes are also in high demand, you know, among the new settlers in Ulster. And by the 1680s, it's in such high demand that the Irish ships are using the Isle of Man as a base of operations for tobacco smuggling. And you know, it's much like, you know, the guy coming to the house, you know, at the back of the van, and you know, do you want to buy a box of cigarettes, you know, and you know, it just shows like things just haven't changed in 400 years. You know, it's great. Not that I'm you know, for that. I am from a border town. I have some it's just like this is going online. I'm not for that at all. Now, some of the things as well that are imported. Funnily, you know, some beef is actually imported. There's loads of it going out of the country, but there's some of it actually coming in as well. And again, some grain, some salmon, herrings, cod. Even the Irish fishing around Ulster wasn't as well developed as it would become later on, and so there are you know, fish stuffs, I suppose, coming in as well, and some bacon, onions, apples. And as I say here, I mean, these are all things that should have been pretty much available in Ulster, but there's still some coming in. So for whatever reason, obviously people felt that there was some sort of market for it. The appearance now of salmon, herring, cod, and along with nets and ropes for fishing, that comes in on one of the loads someone obviously wants to set up as a fisherman. And it implies an underdeveloped fishing industry. Now, maybe under the influence of the new settlers, this is beginning to strengthen. I mean, if people see, you know, like if an enterprising businessman in Carrickfergus sees that salmon, herrings and cod are coming in from Glasgow, then he might think, well, you know, sure, that, you know, I'll start fishing and then I'll cut your man out of it altogether and then I'll make the money. So I would imagine that, you know, that there's something like that going on. Again, you get the great fashions, you know, and you can see the Scottish origins of the settlers coming through. There are references to Scottish grey cloth, to Scottish hats, to blue bonnets, blue cloth, broadcloth, so you know these kind of tartan patterns coming in. But what's also popular as well is a Yorkshire cloth, along with some what they call Genoa fustian. It's a kind of fabric. The hats, stockings, coloured hats for children. I'd love to know what colours they wear. The silk, velvet, you know, very nice cuts. Men's wool knit stockings, ribbon shoes. There's dye, soap and starch also coming in. I mean, these people, you know, had no intention of going native. I mean, they may anglicise to a degree, but they're not really going down the Gaelic route, certainly immediately. And so they hold on to these sort of Scottish fashions and so on, which is, you know, I mean, you can often tell, I mean, you know, if you see someone who's from Eastern Europe, you can often tell just, you know, by the clothes that they're not Irish, you know, because they're wearing something you know, you wouldn't normally see an Irish person wearing. And so you can see the same thing here, you know, that these people are bringing the clothes, the fashions that they're used to. And it's interesting, I mean, some of the depositions from 1641, I think John just mentioned there the Hamilton estate in Killashandra and Cavan, and a couple of Irish rebels are heard talking about how may they approach this particular castle, and so they say they're going to go and find blue bonnets. So from the distance, they'll think they're Scottish. So so you know, obviously these blue bonnets or blue hats are being associated with the Scottish, and so they think that if they put those on and don't open their mouths, they might get within shooting distance. Now again, not so much in terms of books coming in to Ireland, not terribly surprising. I mean, you know, the level of literacy was quite low, and again, not surprising that the books which do come in are religious in origin. It tends to be the way, you know, people weren't getting new John Grisham imported in or anything like that. So these are workbooks that are going to be used in local churches, and they're imported into Derry as part of a far larger consignment. I mean, it's a very small entry. You'd nearly miss it, you know. Only, like I say, the only reason I pulled it up is there's no other books recorded coming into the northern ports at that time, unless there was a very strong black market trade in books at the time. I don't know. There's only one mention in 1632 as part of a load then from Chester to Derry, so that's the next mention as far as we could find. And writing paper is in low demand as well. Literacy is poor, so writing paper, there's some, you do see some writing paper coming in, but not a huge amount of it. And again, it just points to, I mean, when anyone who looks at early modern documents will often notice or pull their hair out, I know I have, about the use of the page. You know, they'll go up here, they'll go down there, over here, they'll, everywhere, because paper was so rare. You know, you used every inch of the page, and so you see them just using all the paper up, and it can get a bit frustrating sometimes when you look at it. But it, you know, it does point to, I think, how literacy moved into Ireland at quite a slow pace, and the way it you know, the people who tended to be able to read were, you know, the very well. The rich people, obviously, and then people like clergy and people like that, they tend to be the people who had use, obviously, for Bibles and things like that as well. What also you find coming in as well is the importation of some equine equipment, stirrups, horseshoes, girdles, saddles, things like this. So again, this doesn't say, so there are not many horses recorded in Ulster's import records. There's a reasonable number in the exports. You know, they're often called nags, you know, and you know, they're sending out, you know, I don't know what they're going to the glue factory or where they were going, and so they are sending over exporting horses out of Ireland, but there's not a real import trade for it. But there is an import trade for the accoutrements associated with horses, like I said, the stirrups and the so on, the horseshoes and so on. So again, it does look like you know, there's a more move to you know, not riding bareback as had been the Irish custom. You know, to sit over your two legs over one side, and so they're bringing in the more English style here as well. And what you also find, I mean, when things like stirrups and girdles and things like that are coming in, they're also being used for ploughing. Because one of the big things you'll find, and John mentioned some of the surveys, the Pinar survey from 1619 and the Irish Commission survey of 1622, what you do find coming up are on estates somebody ploughing by the tail. This was a terrible thing to do. It really annoys the people who are checking up on the estates. Ploughing by the tail was literally you tied the tail to the plough, and I don't think that it was a cruelty to animal issue. It was more that it was associated with the Gaelic Irish. It was sensible in some ways. I mean, if you hit a rock or something, he'll stop fairly quickly if it's tied to the tail. Whereas if he's got the girdle or the stirrups, or, you know what I mean, for pulling the plough. I'm not a farmer, you might notice. You would find, so you do find that there's this move towards an English style of farming, and the big thing, like I say, that they don't like is ploughing by the tail, and you often see it. I often laugh to myself when I see it. I didn't mention one of the things I didn't mention. I spoke on a similar topic to this in Armagh. Was it last year, I think, and at the launch of these books, and there was a gentleman sitting in the front row, and he said, what about the bombs, were they bringing bombs? And I said, well, that was hardly going to be going in the official inventory. But you do see some weapons coming in, unsurprisingly. Now, I mean, again, as John mentioned in his wonderful work on the muster rolls, the lack of weapons is quite alarming, I would have thought, for the British settlers by the 1630s. As Wentworth says, they're a company of naked men, and so there's not a huge amount of weaponry coming in, but there is one very interesting consignment that comes into Derry in July 1615. And there's quite a large amount of weaponry, of gunpowder, of different guns that comes into Derry in 1615 as a result of a rebellion by the O'Cahan family, a Gaelic family, and it's put down quite quickly. But suddenly then the guns are coming in. I mean, it's a bit like, the horse is bolted at this stage. But then it's very interesting, they don't learn the lesson from that, and by 1641, people are still relatively unarmed, and in Clough-Outher, in my own county of Cavan, which was an island castle, which was supposed to be the arms dump in Cavan. The guy who held the constableship there was a guy called Cullum, and by 1641 he gives quite a lengthy deposition. Basically, he's trying to wrangle his way out of any trouble he might get into, because somebody else says about him he had no gunpowder, but he had a bag of plums and half a pound of sugar. This is some great arms dump he's got, So I mean, I think in terms of in the interests of the settlers, they may have wanted to import some more weapons, but over the 30 years between 1610 and 1641. The arms situation does tend to deteriorate. People move from area to area. They bring weapons with them. They don't leave them. Like anyone knows, if you move from one place to another, things just kind of go with you. And that was the way it happened. And so by 1630, there aren't the weapons that should be there, because people have gone from A to B and they haven't left the weapons behind them. I just want to conclude now, because I'm conscious that it's coming up to lunchtime and I'm a bit peckish. Bob did extraordinary work on the 17th century, and we should be so grateful to him for the work that he did, and we should be especially grateful to the Hunter Committee and to his daughter Laura, who so kindly sponsored these publications. Bob, referring to the port book, said they can be used to establish the character of the merchant class of the emerging plantation towns and the incipient commercialisation, which was one of the characteristics of plantation. So obviously the more people there are, money starts coming into play. They can also be used as names are gradually identified, and we have the names of the merchant, oftentimes of the captain of the ship and so on, to indicate the hinterlands of the Ulster ports, for example, Strabane merchants trading through Derry. The commodities exported illuminate the plantation economy, as I've tried to highlight here. The enormous range of imports indicates that Ulster participated in the contemporary consumer society. So, as John says, you know, the new iPhone, these things were coming in. The port books also provide fairly exact information about the places of origin of the ships. I love that phrase, you know, it's very Bob, you know, fairly exact information. So we're not just going to tie it down just totally, but it's not bad. And they also indicate the size of local Ulster merchant fleets. It was great work that he did, and as I say, in those port books you find not only as he says, the commercialisation of a region, but you can also find out about the humanity of the area and the people and the characteristics and what they valued in their society, which, as we've seen, is quite similar to what we value in our own society. Thank you very much.